You've got 10 seconds to step out of that car before I put you on the ground. Deputy Mason Stroud already has the door open and her wrist twisted halfway up her back before she has said a single word in her own defense. He does not know that the woman he is dragging out of a silver 2011 Honda has spent the last 11 months deciding exactly how a morning like this one was going to end for him. Gravel bites into her knee where he forces her against the front quarter panel. His forearm presses flat between her shoulder blades, more weight than the moment requires. Somewhere behind them, on the shoulder of Route 9, a second patrol unit rolls up slow. Light bar still dark, no siren. The way backup arrives when nobody intends to write this down, honestly. Hands where I can see them. Her hands are already where he can see them. He puts the cuffs on anyway. One click, then a second, the metal biting into skin that will bruise by evening. She does not flinch. She does not raise her voice. She turns her head just enough to read the numbers stenciled on his collar, the way a woman memorizes something she intends to use later. The road goes quiet. Then the cuffs lock with a final click, and for one full second, nobody on that stretch of asphalt says anything at all. If a moment like this makes your blood run hot, hit that like button right now. What happens to her over the next 20 minutes is going to make you furious before it makes you feel anything else. 3 weeks before Mason Stroud ran her plates on Route 9, nobody in Ashford Mills, Georgia, knew Tiana Calloway's name. That was the entire point. Ashford Mills sat 40 minutes outside the nearest interstate exit, a town of just under 6,000 people built around a defunct textile mill that had closed before most of its current residents were born. It had one stoplight that actually mattered, a courthouse square with a Confederate-era oak tree the town council had voted 3 times to remove and 3 times decided against, and a population that had for the better part of a century known exactly who belonged to whom and exactly what was expected of anyone new. People here did not move in quietly. They moved in, and the town watched. And within a season, it had decided what kind of person you were going to be allowed to be. She had arrived in late summer, renting the small brick house on Ferris Lane that had sat empty since its previous tenant moved to Macon. She told the leasing office she did freelance bookkeeping, mostly for small businesses that could not afford a full accounting staff, and that she would be working irregular hours. It was, technically, true. She kept a laptop open on the kitchen table most evenings, spreadsheets full of numbers that belonged to nobody, ledgers built to survive a casual glance. She paid her rent on the 1st of every month, in full, never early, never late, the way a person pays when they have learned that consistency is its own kind of camouflage. She locked her front door twice, not because Ashford Mills was dangerous. It was the kind of small Georgia town where people still left bicycles in front yards overnight, but because checking a lock twice was a habit that had outlived the reasons she had first learned it for. She parked nose out in every lot she used, facing the exit, the way a person parks who has spent a long time thinking about how fast she might need to leave somewhere. Nobody in town noticed. Nobody had any reason to. She kept other habits too, smaller ones, the kind that meant nothing on their own. She counted exits in any room she entered, a single glance toward doors and windows before she ever sat down. She memorized license plates that passed her street twice in the same week, filing them away the way other people filed away song lyrics, without effort, without deciding to. She never let her phone screen face upward on a table in public. None of it looked like anything. It looked, at most, like a careful woman, and careful women existed everywhere, in every town, for 100 different reasons that had nothing to do with her actual one. What people did notice within the first 2 weeks was that the new woman on Ferris Lane did not explain herself. Bianca Whitlock noticed first, because noticing was Bianca Whitlock's primary occupation. She was the mayor's wife, president of the Ashford Mills Beautification Committee, and the unofficial registrar of who belonged in this town and who was merely passing through it. She ran into Tiana at the farmer's market on a Saturday morning, in front of a table of heirloom tomatoes, and asked the question she asked every newcomer within their first month. "And what does your husband do?" "I'm not married." Bianca's smile did not move, but something behind it recalculated. "Well, a woman on her own, renting that little house. Must be nice not having anyone to answer to." "It is," Tiana said, and paid for her tomatoes, and left Bianca standing there with a sentence she had clearly expected to land harder than it had. It was a small thing. It would not have mattered anywhere else. But Ashford Mills ran on a particular currency, and Bianca Whitlock controlled most of the supply of it. By the following Wednesday, 3 different women at the community craft sale had heard some version of the same story. That the new woman on Ferris Lane was standoffish, secretive, maybe running from something. The kind of phrase that does enormous damage precisely because nobody has to prove it. Tiana heard about it the way she heard about most things in Ashford Mills. Secondhand, filtered, arriving a day or two late. She did not correct it. Correcting rumors required engaging with people who were not, in any meaningful sense, the actual problem. The actual problem introduced himself on a Tuesday afternoon in October, inside the Dollar General on Magnolia Street. She was in the cleaning aisle when a man in a tan uniform shirt, not a deputy, a private security contractor the store used on weekday afternoons, a heavy-set man named Garrett Pell, who took his unpaid authority more seriously than the badge on his shirt technically supported, stepped into the aisle behind her and asked to see what was in her bag. "I haven't bought anything yet," she said. "Store policy, bag check at register." "Then check it at the register." Pell's jaw tightened. He was not used to being told no by someone who said it without raising her voice. "Ma'am, I'm going to need you to open the bag now, or I'm going to assume you've got a reason not to." She opened it. A wallet, a set of keys, a folded grocery list. Nothing else. Pell looked through it anyway, slower than necessary, the way a man looks through something when the looking itself is the point, rather than whatever he might find. "You can put it back," she said, when he had finished failing to find anything. He did not apologize. He never had a reason to. By the time she reached the register, the cashier, a teenage girl who had clearly watched the entire exchange, would not meet her eyes, and a different employee near the front door had already picked up the store's landline to call someone. That was the first crossed line. It was small enough that nobody outside that aisle would ever know it had happened, and it was exactly the kind of small that, in Ashford Mills, tended to multiply. The following week, at the diner on Main Street where she sometimes ate breakfast alone, a waitress named Dot Pruitt, no relation to the county, a coincidence Dot mentioned to every new customer at least once, overheard her on the phone with a client, walking through a column of figures in language that was crisp, technical, oddly formal for a small-town freelancer, talking about somebody's quarterly receipts. "You talk like you used to work for the government or something," Dot said, setting down a coffee refill, half joking. "Just careful with numbers," Tiana said, and turned the page of her notebook, and the conversation moved on the way small conversations do, leaving behind nothing except a sentence that nobody in that diner would think to remember again until much later. Deputy Mason Stroud arrived at the Dollar General 11 minutes after Tiana had already paid and left, because Garrett Pell's call to the sheriff's substation described a woman who had been belligerent over a routine bag check, who had, in Pell's retelling, gotten aggressive when asked a simple question. Stroud did not go looking for her that day. He filed the description in the part of his memory reserved for people he intended to remember, and he went back to his patrol route, and for 9 days, nothing happened. On the 10th day, Bianca Whitlock called the substation directly, not to report a crime, because there was no crime to report, but to mention, her word, mention, that the woman on Ferris Lane kept unusual hours, that her car had been seen near the county records office twice in 1 week, and that several people in town were starting to wonder what exactly she was doing in Ashford Mills. Bianca did not file a complaint. Filing a complaint would have required her to have a complaint. What she did was plant a question in the mind of a man whose job gave him the authority to go looking for an answer. Mason Stroud had been a deputy in Pruitt County for 9 years. He had 3 prior citizen complaints in his personnel file, 2 for excessive force during routine stops, 1 for an unlawful search that a defense attorney had successfully challenged in court. None of the 3 had resulted in discipline beyond a verbal counseling session with a supervisor who valued department solidarity over documentation. Stroud had learned correctly that very little he did on a public road in Pruitt County would ever be reviewed by anyone with the power to stop him. He started watching the house on Ferris Lane on his own time, off the clock, the kind of attention that exists in no official log and answers to no supervisor. The second cross line happened on a Thursday evening at the public library on Church Street, where Tiana had gone to use a reference computer because the library's records terminal connected to county filing systems her own laptop deliberately did not. She was 3 pages into a property record search when a man's voice behind her, too close, too familiar, asked what she was looking for. It was Stroud, in civilian clothes, off-duty, the badge on his belt the only sign he was anything other than a stranger, leaning over her shoulder. "That's a public terminal," she said without turning around. "Anyone can use it." "Didn't say you couldn't. Just curious what's got you so interested in property filings for a town you've lived in for 2 months." "I'm not required to explain my curiosity to you." He pulled the chair from the next terminal over and sat in it sideways, angled toward her, close enough that she could smell coffee on his breath from hours earlier. "You know, most folks who move here talk about it. Where they're from. Why here? You haven't said 2 words about any of it. Not to me, not to anybody I've heard from." "Maybe nobody's asked me the right way." "I'm asking now." "You're not asking. You're sitting in my space uninvited and calling it curiosity." His hand came down flat on the desk beside her keyboard, not touching her, but close enough that the gesture did the work a touch would have done. "Everybody in this town's got a story, ma'am. Most of them check out. I'm just wondering about yours." A librarian 2 terminals down glanced over once, registered a deputy and a seated woman, and decided, the way people in small libraries often decide, that whatever this was, it was not her business to interrupt. She closed the search window, gathered her bag, and stood, close enough to him that he had to take half a step back to let her pass, which visibly irritated him more than anything she had said. "Have a good evening, deputy." She used his title deliberately. It was the only acknowledgement she gave him that she knew exactly who he was, and exactly what he had just done, and exactly how little it had cost him to do it. That was Tuesday's small humiliation answered with Thursday's larger one, and Stroud carried both of them home with him the way certain men carry every interaction with a woman who refuses to be afraid of them, as a debt that needed collecting. The administrative pressure started the following week, and it moved the way these things always move in towns the size of Ashford Mills, quietly, through people who would never admit to coordinating with each other, each one telling themselves they were simply doing their job. Tiana's landlord, a soft-spoken man named Harlan Doss, who had never once complained about her in 2 months of tenancy, called her on a Monday morning to say that he had received some concerns from neighbors about late-night activity at the Ferris Lane house, and that he would need to schedule an inspection. "What kind of activity, exactly?" she asked. "Lights on late, folks coming and going at odd hours." A pause, the sound of a man choosing his next words carefully. "I'm not saying I believe it, Ms. Calloway. I'm saying I've got people calling me, and I've got a lease to protect. There's been one visitor, once, who left before sunrise. That's the entirety of the late-night activity you're describing." "I hear you, I do. But I'd still like to come by Wednesday, if that's all right, just to put the matter to rest." There had been no late-night activity beyond that single visit. There had been a woman sitting at her kitchen table with a laptop, sometimes past midnight, doing work that looked, from the street, exactly like work. The inspection happened 2 days later. Doss walked through every room with the careful, apologetic posture of a man who knew he was being used and had decided it was easier to go along with it than to ask who was using him. He found nothing. He had known he would find nothing. He left anyway with the awkward, unfinished energy of someone who has just done something he is not proud of and cannot quite explain why he did it. Her 3 remaining bookkeeping clients, small businesses, the kind that ran on reputation and word of mouth, each received some version of the same conversation that week, delivered by acquaintances who framed it as friendly concern. The owner of the hardware store on Magnolia, a man named Felix Ott, who had used her services for 6 months without a single complaint, called her on a Thursday afternoon with his voice pitched low, the tone of a man rehearsing an apology before he had finished deciding to give one. "I want you to know this isn't about your work. Your work's been fine, better than fine. But people talk, and I've got a business that depends on people not talking about me. I think it's best if we go in a different direction for a while." A while, or permanently? The silence on the other end answered the question more honestly than anything he might have said. 2 of the 3 clients called within 4 days to say, with that same visible discomfort, that they had decided to go in a different direction. Had they checked her references? Did they know much about her? Really? It was probably nothing, but you hear things. She lost both contracts without a single person ever stating, out loud, what they actually believed about her. That was the design. Nobody in Ashford Mills had to be wrong about anything, because nobody had committed to a specific accusation. They had only ever wondered out loud, and wondering out loud, repeated enough times by enough people, performs all the functions of an accusation without ever requiring proof. Tiana absorbed each piece of news the same way. A short pause, a measured breath, a note made somewhere private. She did not call Doss to argue. She did not call her former clients to plead her case. Arguing would have required explaining herself, and explaining herself was the one thing she could not afford to do. The first physical contact came on a Friday at the Ashford Mills Town Hall during a public meeting about a proposed zoning change for Ferris Lane and the 3 streets around it. A meeting Bianca Whitlock had organized specifically, though she would later insist the timing was coincidental. The meeting itself ran the way these meetings always ran. A presentation from a county planner nobody in the room had ever met. A handful of residents asking practical questions about setback lines and drainage easements. And Bianca, seated front and center, steering every other comment back toward a single point she never stated outright, that the character of the street had changed since certain new residents had moved in, and that the zoning board ought to take that, in some unspecified way, into account. Tiana attended because the meeting concerned her street, and because not attending would have looked, to anyone watching, exactly like guilt. She sat in the 3rd row, said nothing during the public comment period, and stood to leave when the meeting adjourned at exactly 8 p.m. Bianca caught her in the aisle outside the meeting room, flanked by 2 of the women from the community craft sale, and did not lower her voice. "You know," Bianca said, "some of us have lived here our whole lives, built this town, and then someone moves in, keeps to herself, won't say a word about where she's from or what she's running from, and acts like the rest of us are the ones who owe her an explanation." "I don't owe you anything, Mrs. Whitlock." That's exactly the attitude people are talking about. A hand closed around Tiana's upper arm. Not Bianca's, but one of the women beside her, a heavy-set woman named Connie Pruitt, who had decided in that moment that physically steering Tiana toward the exit was an acceptable extension of the conversation. The grip was hard enough to leave 4 faint marks above her elbow. Tiana stopped walking entirely, planted her feet, and looked down at the hand until Connie, suddenly aware of what she had done in a room with 3 working security cameras, let go. "Don't touch me again," Tiana said, quiet, even, the kind of quiet that carries further than shouting does in a room that has gone abruptly silent around it. Connie's face went red. Bianca's smile thinned into something with no warmth left in it at all. Neither woman apologized. Both of them, within the hour, were telling a version of the story in which Tiana had been the aggressor, in which she had gotten in Connie's face, in which the whole unpleasant scene had been entirely her doing. By the time that version reached Mason Stroud, 2 days later, second-hand and already exaggerated past recognition, it gave him something he had been waiting 3 weeks for. A reason. He found her on the Saturday after the town hall meeting, not at her house, but at the gas station on the edge of Ashford Mills, where she had stopped to fill her tank before a drive she had not told anyone about. He parked his patrol unit at an angle across 2 pumps, which was not procedure, and walked toward her with the particular swagger of a man who believes the conversation he is about to have has already gone his way. "Heard you've been causing some trouble around town." "I haven't broken any laws, Deputy." "That's not what I asked." He stepped closer, close enough that she could see the faint scar above his left eyebrow, close enough that the gas pump's emergency stop button was suddenly the nearest thing within her reach. "I asked if you've been causing trouble. I'm going to finish pumping my gas and leave." His hand shot out and closed around her wrist before she had finished the sentence, twisting it just enough to make a point rather than an injury. A calibrated cruelty, the kind a man practices until he knows exactly how far he can go without leaving a mark that photographs well in a deposition. "You don't walk away from me when I'm talking to you." She did not pull against the grip, because pulling against a grip like that only ever taught the man holding it that he was winning. She held still, let her face show nothing, and said, evenly, "You're hurting my wrist, and there are 2 cameras on this pump island. Let go." He held on for 3 more seconds, long enough to prove to himself that he could, and then released her, shoving her hand back toward her own body hard enough that she had to catch herself against the car. An older man at the next pump had stopped mid-fill, hose still in hand, watching with the particular stillness of someone deciding whether stepping in was worth what it might cost him. He said nothing. Stroud glanced his way once, a look that closed the question before the man had finished considering it. "Watch yourself," Stroud said, and walked back to his cruiser and drove away. And somewhere in his mind he had already decided that the next encounter would not end with him being the one who let go first. She drove home with her wrist throbbing and a list, growing longer by the day, of things that had happened to her in Ashford Mills that no official record would ever reflect, because none of them had ever been written down by anyone with a reason to write them down honestly. 2 days after the gas station, in the parking lot of the post office on Church Street, a small boy broke free of his mother's hand and ran straight toward the lane where a delivery truck was already backing up. Horns silent, the driver's mirror angled wrong. Tiana crossed the distance before anyone else in the lot had finished registering what was happening, caught the boy by the shoulder of his jacket, and pulled him back onto the curb in one motion, smooth and unhurried, the kind of motion that looks, after the fact, far less dramatic than it actually was. The truck rolled past a second later, exactly where the boy had been standing. The mother arrived seconds after, breathless, thanking her in a rush of words that ran together. A man near the entrance, who had seen the whole thing, said only, "You move like you've done that before." Not quite a question, more an observation he expected her to deny. "Lucky reflexes," Tiana said, and walked into the post office, and did not look back to see whether he believed her. It was, on its own, nothing. A stranger catching a child, the kind of small kindness towns like to talk about for a day and then forget. But it was also the second time in 2 weeks that someone in Ashford Mills had looked at her for half a second too long and sensed something underneath the careful, ordinary surface she presented, something neither of them could name, and neither of them pursued. Connie Pruitt found her again 4 days later, outside the same post office, and this time she did not bother with an audience. "People like you come into a town like this," Connie said, low, deliberate, "and you think the rest of us are too polite to say what we're really thinking. We're not. We just usually don't have to. You don't know anything about me, Mrs. Pruitt." "I know enough." Connie's mouth curled. I know you don't belong here, and I know it's only a matter of time before everyone else figures out what I already have." Tiana did not answer that. There was nothing in the sentence worth answering, and answering it would have required treating it as though it deserved a response. The discrepancy that mattered started 2 days later, though nobody but the two men responsible would understand its significance for weeks. Detective Caleb Renfro had worked alongside Mason Stroud for 6 years, long enough to know exactly which version of events Stroud needed on paper before Stroud had finished deciding what that version should be. "That woman on Ferris Lane's going to be a problem," Stroud said, leaning against the break room counter, stirring sugar into coffee he had already stirred twice. "Mark my words." "The bookkeeper? Whatever she is." Stroud's jaw tightened around the word the way it tightened around most things he had decided not to like. "She's got an attitude on her. Talks like she's read the statute book front to back." Renfro didn't ask what that meant, exactly, because he had learned years ago that asking Stroud to clarify a grudge only made the grudge larger. He simply made a mental note to keep an eye on the dispatch logs for that address, the kind of quiet, professional courtesy that men like Renfro extended to men like Stroud without ever calling it what it was. "You find a reason," Renfro said. "I'll make sure the paperwork holds up. That's all I'm asking." When a call eventually came in, he made sure he was the one who reviewed the recording before anyone else did. The call that gave Stroud his opening came on a Wednesday morning, 11 days after the gas station, and it did not come from Bianca Whitlock, though it traced back, eventually, to a conversation she had started. A neighbor on Ferris Lane, an elderly man named Otto Granger who had lived on the street for 40 years and who had absorbed over the previous month every rumor Bianca's network had generated about the woman 2 doors down, called the county non-emergency line to report a vehicle he did not recognize parked outside her house overnight. "Don't know whose car that is," Otto told the dispatcher, peering through his front curtain the way he had peered through it at every unfamiliar vehicle on that street for 4 decades. "Wasn't there yesterday. Just seems like something somebody ought to look into, given everything." "Given everything" was doing a great deal of work in that sentence, and the dispatcher who logged the call did not ask him to unpack it. It was, in fact, a rental car belonging to a colleague who had visited briefly and left before dawn. A perfectly explainable detail that nobody bothered asking her to explain. Stroud took the call himself. He drove to Ferris Lane at 6 a.m., parked across the street with his headlights off, and waited in the gray half-light for the rental car to pull away before he ran its plates, found nothing useful, and then waited longer, parked in plain sight now that there was no longer any pretense of subtlety to maintain, until Tiana's own car backed out of her driveway 40 minutes later on her way to a morning errand. He followed her for 6 minutes before he activated his lights. The stop happened on Route 9, a quarter-mile past the Ashford Mills town line, at 6:41 in the morning, with no other traffic on the road and no reason given over the radio beyond a vague reference to a vehicle matching a description from earlier that morning. This was the moment the story had already shown once, from the outside. The moment of the cuffs closing, the gravel, the silence. What it had not yet shown was everything that came after the silence broke. "License and registration." She handed both through the window without comment. Stroud studied them longer than either document required, the way a man studies something when he has already decided what he is going to do, regardless of what the paperwork says. "Step out of the vehicle." "Can I ask why?" "You can step out of the vehicle." She complied, slowly, hands visible the entire time, the careful, deliberate movement of someone who understood exactly how a moment like this could be misread by anyone holding a weapon and a grudge in the same hand. It made no difference. Stroud had decided, somewhere on the drive from Ferris Lane, that today was the day he stopped letting her walk away first. "I'm going to need to search your vehicle." "I don't consent to a search." "I didn't ask for your consent." "Then you'll need probable cause, and a vague tip about an unfamiliar car parked on a public street, isn't it?" His jaw worked. He had not expected her to know the language, And the fact that she did made him angrier than any insult could have. You think because you read a few things online you know how this works? I think you don't have a reason to search this car, and I think we both know it. That was when he reached for her wrist a second time. The same wrist, the bruise from the gas station still faintly visible above it, and this time he did not calibrate the grip at all. He spun her against the side of the Honda hard enough that her shoulder struck the doorframe, hard enough that the breath went out of her in a short, audible sound that was the only sign of pain she allowed herself to give him. Resisting now? I haven't moved. Looked like resisting to me. The second deputy arrived during this exchange, the backup unit that had idled without lights, and instead of intervening, he stood near the rear bumper with his hand resting on his belt. "Need a hand?" he called out, the question already answered by the way he hadn't moved any closer. "I've got it," Stroud said, and the answer made his grip tighten rather than loosen, a silent endorsement that told him exactly how this report was going to be written before either man had said another word about it. The cuffs went on a second time that morning, this time with her cheek pressed against the cooling metal of the hood, this time with Stroud's knee braced against the back of her thigh, for no reason that any training manual would have justified. This time with a small crowd of 3 cars slowing on the opposite shoulder, 2 phones already raised, already recording, already capturing something that would matter far more than either deputy currently understood. "Hey, you don't have to do that to her," a voice called from across the road. A man who had pulled over without being asked to, who would later give a statement nobody requested from him. Stroud did not look up. "Sir, get back in your vehicle. You got her cuffed already. She's not going anywhere. Get back in your vehicle. You're being detained for obstruction," Stroud said, loud enough for the recording phones to catch it clearly. "Possibly resisting." "I haven't obstructed anything. Tell it to the judge." They put her in the back of his cruiser, not the backup units, a decision Renfro would later describe in his report as standard procedure, though no such standard existed in writing anywhere in the Pruitt County Sheriff's Office manual. The drive to the substation took 11 minutes. She spent every one of them in silence, watching the back of Stroud's head through the cage, memorizing the small details a person memorizes when she has decided that today is the day she stops simply absorbing what is done to her. The mileage on his dashboard, the radio channel he kept tuned to, the exact tone he used when he radioed in that the subject was uncooperative, a word that bore no relationship to anything she had actually done that morning. She thought, briefly, of the 11 months that had brought her to this particular back seat, on this particular road, in this particular county, and of how little any of it would have meant to the 2 men in the front of this car if she had told them the truth at any point that morning. They would not have believed her. Worse, they might have believed her too quickly and adjusted their story to survive it before she had gathered everything she needed to make sure it could not be adjusted away. Patience had gotten her this far. It would have to get her further. At the substation, the booking officer, a tired woman named Risa Marlowe, who had worked the desk for 14 years and had long ago stopped expecting any of it to make sense, read the charges off a printed sheet without much inflection. Obstruction of a law enforcement officer, Georgia Code Section 16-10-24, recited the way a person recites something they have said too many times to feel the weight of it anymore. "Anything you want to say for the record?" Marlowe asked, more out of habit than genuine curiosity. "Just that none of this happened the way it's going to be written down." Marlowe looked up at that, something flickering behind her tired expression, and then looked back down at her paperwork, because looking up for too long at things like that was not a luxury her job allowed her. An assistant district attorney named Levi Brandt arrived at the substation 40 minutes later, sooner than charges of this size usually warranted, drawn by a phone call from Stroud that framed the morning's arrest as more significant than a routine obstruction case. Brandt was thin, precise, the kind of man who had built an entire career on knowing exactly which procedural lever to pull at exactly which moment. He reviewed the charge sheet in the hallway outside the holding cell, then stepped to the small window in the door, studying her the way a man studies a problem he has already decided how to solve. "Miss Calloway, I understand there was some resistance during the stop this morning." "There wasn't. That's not what the report says." "Then the report is wrong." He made a small, unbothered note in his folder, the gesture of a man for whom her objection changed nothing about his afternoon. "I want to be straightforward with you. Obstruction under Georgia law carries up to a year. If we add resisting, that number moves. I can offer a plea today that keeps this small. A fine, no jail time, and this disappears from your record in 18 months. "I'm not pleading to something that didn't happen." "That's certainly an option," Brandt said, in the flat, unhurried tone of a man who had heard that sentence many times before and had never once seen it change an outcome. "Think it over. These offers tend to get less generous the longer they sit on my desk." He left without waiting for an answer, the way a man leaves when he believes the calendar itself will eventually do his arguing for him. 2 desks away, unseen by either woman, Caleb Renfro sat with the dash camera footage already pulled up on his terminal, scrubbing backward through the timestamp with the quiet, practiced patience of a man who had done this kind of editing before and had never once been caught doing it. He adjusted the recorded start time of the stop by 4 minutes, just enough to erase the 6 minutes Stroud had spent following her before activating his lights. Just enough to make the encounter look, on paper, like exactly the routine traffic stop it had never actually been. He checked the adjusted file twice, the way a careful man checks anything he intends to swear to under oath later, and found nothing in it that would contradict the version Stroud had already written. He saved the file, logged it into evidence, and went to get coffee, satisfied with a piece of work that he was certain no one would ever have a reason to look at closely. 3 blocks away, in an office she rarely used for anything but appearances, Bianca Whitlock dialed the substation's general line, asked for an update on that situation on Ferris Lane, and was told, with evident satisfaction, that the woman was in custody and that charges had already been filed. "Good," Bianca said. "It's about time someone in this town asked her some real questions." "You'll be glad to know it traces right back to that tip about the strange car," the desk sergeant added, pleased with himself for the small piece of credit he was handing her. "Well, somebody had to say something," Bianca said. "Nobody else in this town seems willing to." She hung up without leaving her name, the way a person hangs up when they have decided, for reasons that have nothing to do with the law and everything to do with who gets to belong somewhere and who does not, that they have already won. In a holding cell with cinder block walls and a bench bolted to the floor, Tiana Calloway sat with her wrists still marked from 2 separate mornings, and did not cry, and did not argue, and did not ask anyone what was going to happen to her, because she already had a far better sense of what was coming than anyone in that building currently understood. She had spent 11 months in Ashford Mills, learning the shape of a department that had taught itself it could do almost anything to almost anyone without consequence. And this morning had handed her something she had not had before: a charge sheet, a doctored timeline already forming, a recorded confrontation with 3 witnesses and at least 2 working cell phones, and a county attorney who had just offered her a plea deal in writing. None of it was the case by itself. All of it, together, was the beginning of one. She looked up once at the small wall clock above the cell door, its second hand ticking forward in the same patient, indifferent rhythm it kept for everyone who had ever sat on that bench before her. 6 minutes were missing from a video file 2 desks away, and a tip that had started as a rumor at a farmer's market now lived in a case file as a neighbor's innocent phone call. And neither fact had a name attached to it yet that anyone outside 2 offices in Ashford Mills would ever think to ask about. If you want to see exactly how far this goes before it turns, and it turns harder than almost anything else on this channel, make sure you're subscribed, because part 2 is where every single thing that happened today comes back around on the people who did it. Somewhere across Ashford Mills, in a desk drawer that belonged to a man who had no idea his name was about to become part of a federal complaint. A phone began to ring, and nobody answered it. The call was not from a person who suspected anything. It was an automated reminder from the county's records vendor, confirming receipt of the patrol unit's telemetry sync, the GPS and engine log that uploaded to a separate server every 6 hours, regardless of what anyone inside the building did to a video file. Caleb Renfro had edited a timestamp on a recording he controlled. He had never thought to ask whether anything else in that cruiser was still telling the truth. 3 days after the arrest, Tiana stood before a magistrate for a bond hearing that lasted 4 minutes, in a courtroom that smelled like floor wax and old radiator heat. And a public defender named Carla Mercer introduced herself in the hallway outside it with the brisk, apologetic efficiency of a woman carrying 11 other open cases in the same week. "I'm not going to pretend I've had time to read everything yet," Carla said, flipping through a thin folder that contained so far only the charge sheet and the arrest narrative. "But I read enough to have questions about this report." "So did I," Tiana said. Carla looked up at that, something in the flatness of the answer catching her attention longer than she had time to spend on it. "Bond set low. You'll be out by tonight. After that, we talk." They talked 3 days later in a windowless conference room at the public defender's office, where Carla laid out the charge: obstruction of a law enforcement officer, a single count, no resisting added in the end, which she found mildly surprising given how the arrest narrative had been written. "I want to be honest about what you're working with," Carla added. "I've got 41 open cases right now, and most of them get maybe 2 hours of my attention before a hearing. I'm not telling you that to discourage you. I'm telling you because if there's anything you can do to help me move faster on this one, I'll take it." "I understand. They usually stack charges when they're worried the first one won't hold," Carla said. They didn't hear. Either they're confident or they're being careful about how much they put in writing. "Careful," Tiana said. "You sound certain of that." "I've had time to think about it." Carla filed a standard discovery request that week. The dash camera footage, the radio traffic, the incident report, the names of every officer present, and received, 12 days later, a disc containing video that began, according to its own internal timestamp, at 6:45 in the morning, 4 minutes after Deputy Stroud had actually activated his lights, and considerably longer after he had begun following the vehicle in question. Carla watched it twice before she noticed anything wrong. And what she noticed was not in the video at all. It was in the absence of something that should have been there. A few seconds of radio chatter, audible in the brief instant before the recording's first frame, that referenced a stop already several minutes in progress. She filed a second request, narrower this time, for the patrol vehicle's GPS and telematics data for that morning, citing the discrepancy directly. The county's vendor responded within a week, because vendors who manage telematics contracts answer subpoenas faster than sheriff's departments answer public records requests, and the data told a story the video did not. The cruiser had been stationary on Ferris Lane at 5:58 that morning. It had begun moving, following the registered plate of a Honda sedan at 6:35. The recorded video began 10 minutes after that. Carla read the printout twice, then a third time, then picked up her phone. "Miss Calloway, I need you to tell me, honestly, whether you think someone altered this footage." "I think you already believe they did," Tiana said. "Otherwise you wouldn't have called." Carla did not deny it. She spent the better part of the following week doing the unglamorous work that nobody ever filmed for the highlight reel of a case like this, tracking down a man named Walter Combs, the driver who had pulled over uninvited on Route 9 and told Stroud he didn't have to do that to her. Combs answered his door warily, the posture of a man who had already decided he wanted no further part in any of it, until Carla explained, plainly, what she was asking for. "I'm not looking to drag you into anything that cost you," she said. "I just need to know what you saw, in your own words, on paper, with your signature on it." Combs thought about it for a long moment, leaning against his own doorframe. I saw a deputy put his knee on a woman who wasn't fighting him. I saw another deputy stand there and watch him do it. That's what I saw. I don't need it to be more complicated than that. He signed the affidavit at his kitchen table, in handwriting that pressed too hard into the paper, the way a person writes when a sentence matters more to them than they want to admit out loud. Carla found two more witnesses that week. The older man who had stood frozen at the gas station pump weeks earlier turned out to be a retired postal worker named Eugene Holt, who answered her questions carefully, the way a man answers when he has spent 40 years filling out government forms and understands exactly how much a poorly worded sentence can cost someone later. I didn't get involved, Holt admitted. I'm not proud of that, but I saw him grab her wrist, and I saw her tell him there were cameras, and I saw him let go because of it, not because he wanted to. Would you be willing to put that in writing? I should have said something that day. Writing it down now is the least I can do. The mother whose ton Tiana had pulled back from the path of a delivery truck outside the post office, a woman named Priscilla Van, had less to offer about the arrest itself, but a great deal to say, unprompted, about the woman who had moved through that parking lot the way nobody she had ever met moved through anything. She didn't even look scared for him, Van said, just fast, like she'd already decided what was going to happen before it happened. None of it was evidence of anything specific. All of it, filed together in the same folder as the telematics printout, began to read like the outline of someone the county had badly misjudged. The visitor came to the county jail 9 days after the arrest, on a Tuesday afternoon, a man in an unremarkable gray suit who gave his name to the desk sergeant as Samuel Banfield and asked, politely, for 10 minutes with the inmate in holding cell 6. The desk sergeant, a man who rarely deferred to anyone who was not in a uniform, found himself walking the visitor back personally rather than sending a junior officer. An instinct he could not later explain except to say that something about the man's manner made arguing with him feel like a mistake he did not want to make. Banfield sat across from Tiana at the small visitation table, said nothing about why he was there, and asked only one question that meant anything. How are you holding up? Fine. The timeline's moving the way we discussed. A little faster than expected, actually. Washington's aware of where things stand. Has there been any movement on the broader pattern, or are we still building? Still building. What happened to you accelerated some of it, but the office wants this airtight before anyone moves publicly. You know how that part works. I know how that part works. There's also a question of timing for disclosure, if it comes to that. The preliminary hearing's in 5 weeks. If your attorney pushes hard enough on the footage, you may not get to choose when this comes out. I'd rather choose. I know, Banfield said. I'm just telling you it might not be up to you. That's good to hear, Mr. Banfield, she said, and the words carried no irony at all, only the particular gratitude of a person hearing, out loud, a complication she had already privately prepared for. She used his name the way she had used Stroud's title weeks earlier. Deliberately, a small acknowledgement passed between two people who both understood exactly what was being said beneath the words that were actually spoken. He left after 9 minutes, and the desk sergeant walked him out personally again, and neither man discussed why either of them had treated the visit with more weight than a public defender's visit would have received that same week. The night before the preliminary hearing, Levi Brandt met Mason Stroud at a diner 2 towns over, the kind of meeting that left no record because nothing about it was officially anything. Brandt walked him through the questions he intended to ask, the order he intended to ask them in, and the parts of the story that needed to stay simple. Routine stop. Vehicle matched a description. She got argumentative. You responded the way training requires. Keep it short. Don't volunteer anything about the library or the gas station or anything before that morning. What if she brings it up? She's not the one testifying first, Brandt said. By the time she gets a chance to say anything, the record will already favor you. Just don't give her anything to build on. Stroud nodded, The nod of a man who trusted a lawyer's confidence the same uncomplicated way he trusted his own. Neither of them mentioned Renfro by name that night, though both of them understood, without saying so, exactly whose work the footage represented and exactly how much of the morning's story depended on nobody asking the wrong question about it too early. The preliminary hearing was set for a Thursday morning, 6 weeks after the arrest, in the Pruitt County Courthouse before Judge Arthur Lindgren, a man who had sat on that bench for 11 years and had developed, in that time, a settled and rarely examined confidence in the word of any officer who wore the county's uniform. Brandt opened with a brief statement that framed the case as simple. A deputy performing his duty, a defendant who had escalated a routine encounter, charges that reflected nothing more than the facts of an ordinary Tuesday morning. Carla, in her own opening, said only that the state's version of an ordinary Tuesday morning did not match the county's own equipment, and that she intended to show the court exactly where the two diverged. Brandt called Mason Stroud to the stand first. Stroud testified in pressed uniform, hands folded, the posture of a man who had given this kind of testimony before and trusted the rhythm of it the way a person trusts a hymn they have sung 100 times without needing to read the words. "I observed the vehicle matching a description provided by a concerned resident," Stroud said. "I conducted a routine traffic stop. The defendant became argumentative and physically resistant when I attempted a lawful search." "And at any point before this stop," Brandt asked, guiding him gently, "had you been surveilling the defendant's residence?" "No, sir. This was a routine stop based on the morning's call." Carla rose for cross-examination with the GPS printout already in hand. "Deputy Stroud, your patrol vehicle's telematics log places you parked on Ferris Lane at 5:58 that morning, stationary, for over half an hour before the vehicle in question ever moved. Would you like to revise your testimony?" Stroud's jaw worked the way it worked when he was deciding how much of the truth a sentence could survive. "I may have been in the area on an earlier call. The recording you provided in discovery begins at 6:45. The telematics data shows you activated your lights at 6:35. Can you explain the 10-minute gap?" "I'd have to check with the detective who processed the footage." "Detective Renfro?" "Yes. Is it Detective Renfro's practice to adjust recorded timestamps on patrol footage?" Brandt was on his feet immediately. "Objection. Calls for speculation." "Sustained," Lindgren said, though something in his expression had shifted, a small crack in the settled confidence he had walked into the room with. Carla called Walter Combs next, briefly, just long enough to put his signed account into the record under oath. "I saw the deputy put his knee against her leg after she was already cuffed," Combs told the court plainly, without embellishment. "I told him he didn't need to do that. He told me to get back in my vehicle." "Did the defendant, at any point you observed, behave aggressively toward either officer?" "No, ma'am, she didn't move much at all. That's what struck me about it." Brandt's cross-examination of Combs lasted less than 2 minutes and accomplished little beyond confirming that Combs had no relationship to the defendant prior to that morning, a fact Carla had already anticipated and had no trouble letting stand uncontested. Brandt, sensing the ground slipping under his own case, called Caleb Renfro to the stand sooner than he had originally planned, hoping a second officer's calm authority might settle what Stroud's testimony had unsettled. It did not work the way Brandt intended. "Detective Renfro, did you process the dash camera footage from the morning in question?" "I did." "Is it standard practice for you to review and log footage before it's entered into evidence?" "It is." Carla rose for cross-examination. "Detective, the footage you log begins at 6:45 a.m. The patrol vehicle's own telematics system shows it had already been in motion, following the defendant, for 10 minutes before that. Can you explain that discrepancy?" "Equipment malfunctions happen. Dash cameras don't always start recording the instant a unit is activated." "Is that what happened here?" "I'd have to check the equipment logs." "You logged this footage into evidence personally. Did you at any point during that process adjust the recorded start time?" Brandt objected before Renfro had to answer. On relevance grounds this time, and Lindgren, after a pause that lasted slightly longer than his previous rulings had, sustained it. But the pause itself had said something the ruling could not erase, and Renfro stepped down from the stand a few minutes later with the particular stiffness of a man who understood that the next question, whenever it finally came, was not going away. The hearing recessed for 15 minutes, and when it resumed, Carla rose again, this time with a different kind of request. Your Honor, before we continue with the state's witnesses, my client has asked for the opportunity to address the court directly, with the court's permission, regarding a matter relevant to these proceedings. Brandt objected on procedural grounds. Lindgren, visibly uncertain, weighed the irregularity of the request against the irregularity that had already crept into his courtroom over the previous 20 minutes, and decided, against his own instincts, to allow it. Tiana stood. She did not raise her voice. She did not perform anything for the gallery. She simply reached into the folder Carla had been holding, removed a sealed envelope that had arrived by federal courier 2 days earlier, and placed its contents on the evidence table in front of the bench. A credential wallet, a badge, and a single-page letter on Department of Justice letterhead, signed above a typed name that read, Samuel R. Banfield, Supervisory Special Agent. Your Honor, my name is Tiana Calloway. I am a special agent with the Federal Bureau of Investigation. For the past 11 months, I have been conducting an authorized undercover investigation into a pattern of civil rights violations within the Pruitt County Sheriff's Office, under the authority granted to the Bureau by Title 28, Section 533 of the United States Code. This letter from my supervising agent confirms my assignment and authorizes disclosure of my identity at this time. She paused, the room still silent around her, and added the part that mattered most to the proceeding directly in front of them. I want to be clear that nothing about my assignment authorized or excused what happened to me on Route 9. The decision to stop, search, and detain me that morning was made independently by Deputy Stroud, based on information that traces back to civilian rumor rather than any lawful basis for suspicion. I am not asking this court to treat me differently than it would treat any other defendant in my position. I am asking it to treat the evidence the same way it would for anyone else, now that the evidence is complete. The courtroom did not erupt the way courtrooms do in stories built to entertain, rather than to be believed. It went, instead, almost perfectly silent, the particular silence of a room full of people, each independently recalculating everything they thought they had understood about the last 6 weeks. Levi Brandt stood without immediately knowing what he intended to say once he was standing. He opened his mouth twice before anything came out. Your Honor, the state was not provided notice of any federal involvement in this matter. Neither was I, Mr. Brandt, Lindgren said, and the dryness in his voice was the closest thing to humor the room would get that morning. Mason Stroud's face went through 3 visible stages: confusion, disbelief, and finally something that looked very much like the specific dread of a man watching his own testimony become evidence against him. He did not say anything. There was, by that point, nothing left in his posture that resembled the confidence he had walked in with. A reporter in the back row, the same local journalist who covered every zoning meeting and every minor county dispute for a paper most of Ashford Mills only read on Sundays, was already typing on her phone, the small mechanical sound of it the loudest thing in the room for several seconds. Her story ran 2 days later under a headline that named no one directly, careful with the legal exposure that came with reporting on an active federal matter, but specific enough in its details that everyone in Ashford Mills who had followed the case understood exactly who and what it was describing. Judge Lindgren picked up the letter, read it twice, and looked at Tiana for a long moment before he spoke. Ms. Calloway, Agent Calloway, I'll need this verified before I can take any of it as established fact in this proceeding. Of course, Your Honor. The contact information for my supervising agent is on the letter. I'd ask that the court verify it now, while the witness is still under oath. It took 11 minutes for the courthouse clerk to reach Samuel Banfield's direct line, and 11 more for Banfield to confirm, in a brief recorded call placed on the courtroom speaker with the judge's permission, exactly what the letter already said. When the call ended, Lindgren set the receiver down slowly, the gesture of a man recalibrating an entire morning's worth of assumptions in real time. "Detective Renfro," Lindgren said, to no one in the room directly, the name simply surfacing because it was the next loose thread that needed pulling. "I'd like that footage and the original, unedited file from the vendor's server pulled and compared before this hearing reconvenes." In the hallway outside, during the recess that followed, Carla found Tiana standing near a window, watching nothing in particular through the glass. "You could have told me," Carla said. Not an accusation, just a fact she was still adjusting to. "I couldn't, not until the timing was right, and not until I knew you'd built enough of the case on your own that nobody could say later you'd been handed it." Carla considered that for a moment. "That's a strange kind of compliment." "It's the only kind I had to give you." Carla almost smiled. 11 months. You really did all this without anyone in town suspecting a thing." "Almost anyone," Tiana said, and did not elaborate further. And Carla, sensing the boundary of what she was going to be told, did not push. What happened over the following months did not resemble anything close to the swift, total reckoning that the courtroom moment seemed to promise. Mason Stroud was placed on administrative leave with pay within 48 hours, pending an internal affairs investigation that the sheriff's office described, in a brief statement, as routine. He was not arrested that day or that week. His internal affairs hearing was held 4 months later in a windowless conference room at the county administration building before a 3-member panel that included the sheriff's chief deputy, a representative from the county attorney's office, and an outside reviewer brought in specifically because the department's own credibility had become part of what was under examination. Stroud's union attorney delivered an opening statement arguing that the stop had been lawful at its inception, and that any procedural irregularities in the footage were the responsibility of evidence technicians, not the deputy himself. The panel reviewed the telematics data, the Combs affidavit, and a use of force expert's written assessment, concluding that the level of physical restraint applied during the second handcuffing exceeded what the circumstances justified. Stroud was permitted to make a brief statement on his own behalf, which he used mostly to describe his 9 years of service and the stress of working a rural patrol route with limited backup. The panel did not rule that day. It rarely does. 3 weeks later, the sheriff's office issued a 1-paragraph finding. The use of force during the second detention was not consistent with department policy, and Deputy Stroud's employment was terminated effective immediately, separate from, and in addition to the criminal charges already filed against him by the district attorney's office. Stroud cleared out his locker the following morning before anyone else arrived. The badge he had worn for 9 years sitting on the counter where the chief deputy had asked him to leave it. He did not call anyone to say goodbye, and nobody from the department called him either. The particular silence of an institution that had decided, once the cost of defending him exceeded the value of keeping him, to simply let him go quietly and move on to managing whatever came next. The Pruitt County District Attorney's Office had, by then, taken 11 weeks total to review the telematics evidence, the original unedited footage recovered from the vendor's backup server, and 3 witness statements from the roadside that morning before formally charging him with violating Georgia's false statement statute and referring a separate excessive force complaint to the state's Peace Officer Standards and Training Council for license review. He hired a union attorney within the week and has not, as of the most recent filing, entered a plea. Detective Caleb Renfro fared somewhat worse, in the narrow sense that the evidence against him required no testimony to interpret. The recovered backup file showed, in metadata even Renfro had not thought to examine, the exact timestamp of his edit and the user credentials used to make it. He was placed on unpaid leave within a week of the hearing. then formally charged under the state's tampering with evidence statute, a charge that carries the realistic likelihood of a negotiated plea rather than a trial, given how rarely cases like his ever reach one. He came to the sheriff's office on a Friday afternoon to turn in his resignation in person, a folder of paperwork under one arm, and found the chief deputy waiting for him at the front desk rather than in his office. A small, deliberate signal that this conversation was not going to happen behind a closed door. "Didn't think it'd come to this," Renfro said. "Neither did I," the chief deputy said. 4 minutes, Caleb. That's all it would have taken to leave that footage alone." Renfro had nothing to say to that, and after a moment he simply set the folder on the counter and left, a resignation the sheriff's office accepted without further comment. The Pruitt County Sheriff, a man who had spent 6 years insisting that complaints against his deputies were rare and unfounded, stood at a podium outside the courthouse 2 days after the hearing and announced an external review of the department's use of force policies and a third-party audit of cash camera retention practices, both framed in his public statement as proactive steps rather than admissions of anything specific. "This office takes any allegation of misconduct seriously," he told the small cluster of reporters, reading from a page his attorney had clearly reviewed, line by line. "We are cooperating fully with all appropriate authorities, and we ask the public to allow these processes to run their course." A reporter asked whether he intended to apologize to Agent Calloway directly. He said only that the matter remained under review and stepped away from the podium before any second question could land. Whether either internal review would produce anything beyond a binder full of recommendations remained, for now, an open question that nobody in Ashford Mills expected to see answered quickly. 6 weeks after the hearing, the Civil Rights Division of the State Attorney General's office, working in coordination with federal authorities under the Pattern or Practice Authority found in Title 34, Section 12,601 of the United States Code, confirmed it had opened a formal investigation into the Pruitt County Sheriff's Office, citing Agent Calloway's documentation among multiple sources gathered over the preceding year. "This is not a single incident inquiry," the division's lead investigator told reporters at a brief press availability. "We're examining whether a pattern exists across multiple stops, multiple complainants, and multiple years. That work takes time, and we intend to do it thoroughly rather than quickly." Investigations of that scope, historically, take 12 to 18 months to produce findings, and the office made no promises about what those findings would ultimately require. The obstruction charge against Tiana Calloway was dismissed by nolle prosequi 3 weeks after the hearing, a one-line filing that closed the case without ever requiring Levi Brandt to say, in any formal document, that he had been wrong about anything. Banfield called her the same afternoon the filing went through. "Officially it's over," he said. "Unofficially, you understand it's just getting started for everyone else." "I understand. There'll be depositions, probably a civil suit eventually, separate from anything criminal. You may get called back to Pruitt County more than once before this is finished." "I figured as much." "For what it's worth," Banfield said, 11 months is a long assignment to carry alone, and you carried it without a single mistake that anyone in that department managed to catch. That doesn't happen often." "It happens when you don't have a choice," Tiana said, and there was no bitterness in it, only the plain accounting of a person who had simply done the job in front of her because it was in front of her. He gave a single brief statement to a local reporter describing the dismissal as appropriate given new information, a sentence engineered to concede nothing while appearing to concede everything. He kept his position. Nobody in Ashford Mills expected otherwise. Bianca Whitlock's name surfaced publicly 6 days after the hearing, when the same local reporter who had been typing in the back row, working from court filings and a leaked call log, reported that the original tip about a vehicle near the county records office had originated from her, not from any neighbor with a genuine concern. She tried for a few days to manage the story the way she had always managed every other story in Ashford Mills, calling acquaintances to frame her involvement as a misunderstanding. A simple, civic-minded phone call blown out of proportion by people who had never liked her in the first place. It did not work the way it always had before. The currency she had spent her whole life accumulating in this town had depended on nobody ever holding her accountable for spending it. And once a single reporter did, the rest of it did not take long to follow. Connie Pruitt confronted her outside the grocery store the following week, less out of loyalty than out of the particular fear of someone watching a friend's fall and recalculating her own exposure. "You told me it was just a phone call. You didn't tell me it'd end up in a federal investigation." "I didn't know it would either," Bianca said, and for the first time in the entire conversation, something in her voice had lost its usual certainty. "I thought I was just asking a question." "That's what you always say." "It's what's always been true." Connie did not answer that, only looked at her for a long moment, the way a person looks at someone they have just stopped being able to fully trust, and walked into the store without another word. She faced no criminal charge because there was none to bring. Civilian gossip that motivates an officer's misconduct is not, on its own, a crime, however much damage it does. She resigned from the beautification committee within the week, citing personal reasons, and was seen at the following month's town hall meeting sitting quietly in the back row, a seat she had never once occupied before, saying nothing during the public comment period for the first time anyone in that room could remember. Connie Pruitt apologized to no one. Garrett Pell kept his job at the Dollar General. Otto Granger, when a reporter asked whether he regretted the call that had set so much in motion, said only that he had reported what he saw and that he did not see what that had to do with anything that happened after. Tiana Calloway left Ashford Mills on a gray Tuesday morning in late winter, the brick house on Ferris Lane already cleared of the laptop and the spreadsheets and the small, careful habits that had never once given her away. The morning before she left, Walter Combs found her loading the last of her boxes into a rented car and crossed the street without being asked to, the way he had once crossed a different distance on Route 9. "Didn't figure I'd get a chance to say it properly," he said. "What you did, sitting through all that without giving them anything to use against you, that took something most people don't have. You're the one who stopped your car and told a deputy to back off," she said. "That took something too." He shrugged, the particular shrug of a man uncomfortable being thanked for doing what he considered the bare minimum. "Anybody would have." "Not anybody," she said, and meant it, and he did not argue the point further, just nodded once and walked back across the street to his own life, which would go on largely unchanged by any of it, the way most lives in Ashford Mills would. Dot Pruitt, from the diner, sent no note and made no public comment, but the next time a federal courier truck passed through town on an unrelated delivery, she mentioned to a customer, almost to herself, that she'd always known there was something different about that woman, and left it there, the closest thing to an apology Ashford Mills was ever going to get from anyone who had repeated a rumor without checking it first. She did not say goodbye to anyone else, because there had never really been anyone else in Ashford Mills who had known her well enough to be owed one. She drove past the courthouse once on her way out of town, past the diner where Dot Pruitt still poured coffee, and still occasionally told new customers about the woman who used to talk like she'd worked for the government. Past the town hall where Bianca Whitlock now sat in the back row instead of the front, and felt, in all of it, less triumph than a kind of tired, complicated relief. The particular feeling of someone who had done a job correctly and would still be doing pieces of it in depositions and phone calls and follow-up interviews for a long time to come. The investigation she had spent 11 months building continued without her physical presence in the town, carried forward now by an attorney general's office and a federal review that moved at the unhurried pace such reviews always move at, regardless of how dramatically any single morning inside them might have unfolded. Preliminary findings, when they eventually came, would likely take the careful, hedged language such findings always took, patterns identified, recommendations issued, enforcement contingent on resources and political will that no single morning on Route 9 could guarantee. She had learned not to expect more than that. Wanting more than that was how people in her line of work burned out, chasing endings that real institutions almost never provided. If this story landed for you, hit like before you go. And if you're new here, subscribe, because every story on this channel ends the same way the next one begins, with someone deciding not to walk past. 3 weeks after she left, Carla Mercer received an unmarked envelope at her office. No return address, containing a single photocopied page from an old arrest report. A different defendant, a different year, the same deputy's signature at the bottom, the same pattern of a timestamp that did not quite match the radio log beside it. There was no note attached, no explanation of who had sent it or why, only the document itself sitting on her desk the next morning, like a question nobody in Ashford Mills had yet worked up the courage to ask out loud. Carla read it twice, set it down, and picked up her phone before she had fully decided what she intended to say once someone answered. She put it in a folder of its own, marked it with a date and nothing else, and did not yet know what she was going to do with it. Somewhere beneath that uncertainty sat the much larger question the Federal Review had not yet finished asking. How many mornings like that one had happened on roads like Route 9 before anyone with the standing to stop it had ever been watching closely enough to notice? Nobody in Ashford Mills had an answer yet. The story that had started with a pair of handcuffs on a quiet stretch of asphalt was, by every measure that mattered, only just beginning to be told. Mason Stroud lost the badge he carried for 9 years, fired after his own department ruled his actions inconsistent with policy, now facing criminal charges and a license review that could end his career for good. Caleb Renfro resigned in disgrace, charged with tampering with evidence. Bianca Whitlock lost her seat on the beautification committee, exposed as the woman whose idle phone call set this entire nightmare into motion. But here is what this story is really about. Tiana Calloway should never have needed an FBI badge, a federal letter, or 11 months undercover just to be treated like a human being on a quiet Georgia road. So ask yourself this: what about the people who do not carry a badge in their pocket? No camera rolling, no federal letter in an envelope, no one coming to verify their word over an officer's. What happens to them on mornings like that one? Tell me in the comments. Share this with someone who needs to see it. Like this video, subscribe, and hit that bell, because the next story is already waiting. Every story on this channel is about one thing: the moment truth finally catches up. And it always does.